Sydney ferries have been carting workers and tourists across the harbour for well over a century. But after decades of neglect, a special inquiry into the iconic ferry service warned the New South Wales Government the whole fleet needed urgent replacement and was so badly mismanaged there was little choice but to hand it over to the private sector. More than a year later, the Rees Government still appears paralysed over ferry reform. Deborah Cornwall reports.
Good morning, madam. How are you?
Oh, it's absolutely beautiful, majestical way to get to work, really.
It's not fast. It's like having slow food. It's enjoying the moment.
It's an ageing patchwork fleet, but for most Sydney-siders, Harbour ferries remain the one true pearl in the city's rapidly crumbling public transport system.
The tapestry of our life, the quality of our life in Sydney, is largely described by memories of ferry trips.
Sydney's jammed roads and rail network have grabbed all the headlines in recent years, while the city's postcard ferry service has drifted, operating in much the same way as it has for decades.
Something chuffs along okay and it doesn't attract, any attention. It basically looks good, no one complains. So when the spotlight inevitably comes back, it's shock horror. What's happened to our lovely ferry service? It's been run down.
In 2007, ferries suddenly came back on the radar after 2 fatal ferry accidents killed 5 people. Sydney Ferries was ultimately cleared of any blame over the deaths, but a full inquiry into the service revealed an organisation so dysfunctional and badly managed. The man who led the inquiry, Barrister Brett Walker, described its fleet of 31 vessels as little more than a working ferry museum.
The taxpayers aren't getting value, the customers are not getting anywhere near a reliable enough service. A picturesque scenery does not make up for the ferry not turning up, and it's much worse than it ought to be.
The Special Commission of Inquiry into Sydney Ferries issued a 421-page report, and there was barely a page of that report that did not contain the most scathing of findings about the way the place has been managed. They've had 12 CEOs in 15 years.
The report also pointed to a raft of other problems. In recent years, patronage has plummeted while the costs of running the service have soared. The old ferries also break down so often, commuters are regularly left stranded. And when they do show up, ferry timetables remain out of sync with bus and rail connections.
You go to Circular Quay, and if you want to use a train, a bus or a ferry, there's 3 separate ticket booths. There's just crazy things like that. It's far from being iconic. It really is the Cinderella of the transport network.
The maritime unions also came under attack for their above-market wages and 1950s work practices. But in the end, Brett Walker pointed the finger squarely at Sydney Ferries management, which he said was also chronically undermined by state government interference. The service, he said, needed to be dragged into the 21st century, starting with the urgent $400 million replacement of the whole fleet and ultimately handing over the reins to the private sector.
I am quite sure that the future for ferry public transport in Sydney will be by a private provider. It has to be attended to, otherwise it'll just decline, which is absurd.
The Walker report also laid out the blueprint on how the government could dramatically expand existing ferry services, opening up new routes to thousands more commuters in Sydney's west and eastern suburbs. If current services tripled, Sydney's harbour could operate as a sort of aquatic highway, offering much-needed relief for Sydney-siders already struggling with the city's gridlocked traffic.
The waterfront in Sydney is Parramatta River, not just the harbour you see on the postcards. And so there are old industrial sites that have been made into residential subdivisions. They should have been, they still could be, linked directly to ferries.
It's a visionary scheme, but one which the unions say is fraught with danger if ferries are forced into partnership with the private sector.
Have your way, here to stay till Bass and Flinders go away.
In February this year, there was a howl of protests from unions and the government allowed private operators to take over the high-speed Jetcat ferry service to Sydney's Manly Beach, claiming they could no longer afford to run the service.
I don't think privatisation works for ferries any more than it works for trains or buses.
Among Labor Party hardheads, there's also the abiding belief that ferries are only an issue for tourists and the well-heeled commuters of Sydney's leafy North Shore. And there's no votes in helping out the Liberal voting heartland.
I think that it is totally unhelpful politically for there to be a singling out of any mode of transport as saying, well, that's for the Silvertails, we can neglect it, let them use their Mercedes. That's what's led us into the problem, that people can say that there's always the default option, get in your motor car. And Sydney, I would have thought, is an international demonstration as to how big a mistake that is.
Such as the paralysis of the New South Wales Government, no one, not even insiders, believe it has the will or the capability to fix the city's public transport problems, let alone its ferries. Almost a year and a half after the Walker report was handed down, the only decision by Premier Rees so far has been a promise to revisit the issue sometime next year.
We're stopping a step short of privatising at this stage, but everyone is on notice. If the private sector comes to us with better standards of service at a more competitive price, then we will move.
In a way, Nathan Rees has cut Sydney Ferries adrift. He's decided to wait another year before really installing any kind of reform there at all. But have a look at the timing. In a year's time, he's going to be right up against the election, and something tells me he's not going to want a war with the maritime unions then either.
You'd be mad to think ferries were the top of the list for people nowadays. But there's an opportunity which ought to be taken. It would be a great pity if the little gem, which is the Sydney ferry service, could not be fixed either before or alongside everything else that has to be done.
That report from Deborah Cornwall. That's the program for tonight. Coming up next, a special